I don't consider myself an expert in fatigue. People who experience fatigue are experts in fatigue. My job is to listen and really try to use the knowledge that I have to try to help them make sense of their experience, and also use knowledge from other people about how they've managed to cope and what they've found helpful, and pass that knowledge on. So I want to thank all the people that I've ever worked with. That's how I've got to learn as much as I have now. But everyone I work with teaches me something new, and I think that's really important that we keep ourselves open and keep listening, and why I really thank you for inviting me to be here today. I've actually got quite a personal connection to cardiac arrest. Sadly, my stepfather actually passed away from a catastrophic brain injury following a sudden cardiac arrest. So I'm really pleased to see so many survivors here today, and I'm really keen to hear your experiences and see how much that resonates with the population that I more typically work with, as with Barbara. I'm at the Oliver Zangwill Centre for Neuropsychological Rehabilitation. We're based in Ely in Cambridgeshire. We see patients from all over the country. But typically the majority of the people that we see are actually people who have had a traumatic brain injury or some kind of bleed within the brain. But it's true, we also have seen the odd person who has had a hypoxic injury from cardiac arrest, and I suspect there's more people out there that might benefit from the kind of rehabilitation that we do. And as a result of this, I'm going to start tapping into some of my OT colleagues to see how we can try to sort of make our presence more aware, and see how we as occupational therapists can try to be supportive both in hospital and, what I'm hearing is, particularly in the community setting. So thank you for inviting me to speak. What I'm hoping to cover today is to try to give a sense of what I understand fatigue to be, both from reading the scientific literature but also from speaking to others, and see if that resonates with your experience. Try to help you make sense of why it occurs, and that's really complicated. More particularly, what can we actually do about it? And I'd be really interested to hear over lunch about your experiences in the room, to sort of say what's worked for you and what hasn't, so we don't reinvent the wheel, and then answer any questions you may have on this particular topic. So, one of the first things I really want to say is, because this is something, a myth that's come up time and time again in hearing people talk about fatigue, is it's not laziness. After an injury that's affected the brain, many people experience fatigue, and in the acquired brain injury population as a whole, up to 70% of people might experience extreme fatigue at some point or another. And for some people that changes after a period of time, and for others that might persist. And one of the challenges that we experience is that there is no agreed medical definition of fatigue. Still, in the literature across the world, many people have tried to come up with a definition that everybody is agreeing on. And because of that lack of agreed definition, we haven't come up with an appropriate measurement tool to know how often it occurs and how severe it occurs after people experiencing a range of different medical conditions, not just acquired brain injury. So it's really hard to define and measure, therefore it's really hard to research, really hard to come up with, therefore, studies and outcomes as to know what helps and what doesn't. And this is why it's really important that we keep listening and keep searching and keep trying to understand what's happening. What we do know is that people who experience fatigue after some kind of illness or injury say it feels very different from the kind of fatigue or tiredness that you and I all experience after maybe a busy week or a particularly late night. We all have experienced fatigue from time to time, but this feels different. It's a much greater intensity, it tends to last longer, and it might not actually come on immediately after the event that's actually perhaps triggered it. It might take a delay, so it's actually very difficult to sort of work out what's actually been a trigger for fatigue. It's really commonly reported in a range of conditions, and the study that Paul, thank you very much, sent me showed that after a year after cardiac arrest and a hypoxic injury, about half the survivors were complaining of fatigue. And it has a practical impact. Fatigue impacts on all the other things that we're trying to deal with. It has a massive impact on everyday activities, and that then has a corresponding impact on how we feel about ourselves, on our mood, on our relationships, and so on and so forth. So we can get into quite a vicious cycle. So what is it? So having described that it's different from the experience of before an injury, can I ask survivors, survivors of fatigue, to put their hands up in the air, just generally, just so I know who the survivors are. Great. And now keep your hands up. Put your hand down if you have not experienced this kind of fatigue after your injury. I'm not seeing a single hand go down. So that's fine. We have 100% then. Thank you very much indeed. So it'd be really good as part of the survey to really understand that. So, and for those people who are living with others who are surviving this kind of event, how do you make sense of fatigue? How do you understand that? Do you notice it? What impact is it having? So we've all got different ways that we try to cope when we're experiencing any different kind of symptoms, haven't we? Be it memory, be it fatigue. We've all got different ways of making sense of it, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's been so hard to define. But what I'm hearing people describe is a kind of 3 different types of fatigue. A physical type of fatigue, and that can happen for many different reasons, and we've got a speaker later on today who's going to be particularly focusing on cardiac rehab and energy and trying to maintain physical fitness after a cardiac arrest, so I'm not going to talk so much about that in this presentation. But I'm particularly going to focus on the kind of mental and emotional fatigue that people talk about after an illness or event. And the kind of things that people tell me are that it's much harder to remember, to think sometimes to find the word you want to say, that horrible tip of your tongue feeling, and you'd feel such a fool. It happens to me quite a lot in these presentations, so sorry if that happens today. And people can get more easily distracted as well. It's harder to communicate as effectively. People might find after a while they start to slur their words, for example. People might experience less tolerance of noise, of light, and crowded areas. It's just like sensory overload. People might become more clumsy, feel tired quicker, sort of have a heaviness in their limbs. It feels like they're trudging through treacle. And for some people, they may feel irritable, frustrated, tearful, or overwhelmed at times. Is that your experience as well, those of you in the room nodding? Yeah. All of the above. Okay. So, why does fatigue occur? So what we developed at the Oliver Zangwill Centre in combination with colleagues and other people we were working with was a sort of, it's called a model, which we then turn into a formulation because we're neuropsychologically based. So we try to make sense of something in a simpler way as possible when actually it's really complex and it's bamboozling all the best brains in the world, fatigue. Why does it occur? We need to understand why it occurs, and everybody is individual, just like as Barbara was saying earlier on. We might be presented with fatigue, but there may be very different reasons why that fatigue is occurring for that particular person at that particular time, and we have to unpick that so that we pick the right kind of intervention for it. So we need to understand why it occurs, and so does the person to whom it's occurring. So this is a collaborative effort. We build this together, this shared understanding. We need to understand what activities or situations might wear us out really quickly. Even sitting listening here, probably your energy levels have dropped. Fascinating though it is, your energy levels are dropping and dropping and dropping as you're trying to process all this new information that you're hearing. And you're all probably ready for lunch as well. But there will be certain activities that are kind of particular triggers, and often when I've described this to people, we talk about smartphones and batteries on smartphones, and how if you have lots of apps open, there are some really greedy apps that really drain the battery. I think Google Maps is one of them, because I've experienced that on the way here this morning. They really drain your battery really quickly, but then if you have apps open in the background, they're still nibbling away at your battery life. And so sometimes we have to work out, actually, do I have enough energy left for the things I want to do the rest of the day, or do I have to recharge myself, and how on earth do I do that? We need to understand what our warning signs are for fatigue. So many of us can actually describe how fatigue feels when it really hits, when we're at kind of rock bottom, we're kind of sort of 10% or less on our battery. But what we need to do is get better at noticing perhaps more at halfway, because then we've still got some resources where we can go, oh, hang on, this is how I'm feeling. What can I do about it? Do I need to take a break now? So we need to sort of start to spot our own personal warning signs, and that might be part of the work that we do. And then there are a number of different things that affect how we respond. This is my because I'm a human being and I can be cantankerous if I want to box. But sometimes we know what's good for us. I know I should be exercising more. Am I? No. I'm still eating cake and doing all wrong things. So sometimes we know, but we kind of carry on doing something anyway. And that's just human nature. Sometimes we might not know the right thing to do. Often what happens is the way that we used to cope with stressful situations before the cardiac arrest occurred, we will try those ways afterwards because they've worked for us before, so why wouldn't they work for us now? But actually some of those might no longer be effective ways of coping. So one example of that would be sort of like, well, I'm just going to crack on and get it done because then I can take a rest. And then we end up in a kind of boom and then a bust sort of scenario. And we might not know about the ways that we could respond that might help us to maximise our energy and our efficiency going forwards. So there are lots of different reasons why fatigue might occur and why you might be more vulnerable to experiencing fatigue after a cardiac arrest. We've heard this morning about there may be some kind of hypoxic damage to the brain, which might affect the way that the brain talks to one another. So it may affect particular areas, like Barbara was talking about the hippocampus, which is important in laying down memories. But actually what we're learning more and more about the brain, and as we've got the scans to see it, is how different parts of the brain need to talk to one another. No one part of the brain works in isolation from any other. And actually it's those networks and how efficiently and quickly information can pass from one part of the brain to another down a network that it can actually be disrupted after an injury and can make it really difficult then to coordinate and not only take in but process and then produce an output appropriate to the situation around us. Okay? It's therefore more effortful to use our cognitive thinking skills and on top of any cognitive difficulties we may have sustained at that point in time. So I often use the analogy of a road network. Let's imagine we all want to go to Devon on Bank Holiday Monday. We've all got our caravans, we're all ready to go, and we all set off at the same time. What's likely to happen? Roadblocks, yeah? We might hit a roadblock, we might sort of have to sit around, takes longer for information, longer to get there. Some of us might give up and go home and have a cup of tea, start again a bit later on. But what happens in everyday life and how I make sense of that, it's like the brain is trying to work on only partial information. And sometimes it might get it right, it might have enough information to get it right and be able to execute the task that we're trying to do, and sometimes it might not have information. Okay? When we get things wrong, we start to beat ourselves up. We have that internal voice of, oh, for goodness sake, I've done this again. What on earth? Shouldn't I have? This is all taking energy. This is all taking energy away from the things that we need to do during the day. So this is where we can sometimes start to see how mood-related factors come in, on top of very real worries like, is this going to happen to me again? How am I going to pay the bills? All of those kinds of very real-life worries are coming in. Physical factors can contribute, so like deconditioning, as we said. Thank you. I was looking in the wrong way. As well as other factors such as being in pain. How effortful is it to think through pain? How effortful is it to think and do things when you had a really poor night's sleep? What about side effects of other types of medication you might be taking as well? So the why fatigue occurs is really complicated, and we have to try to tease that apart. It's a bit like a detective thing, I always think, which is why I love Agatha Christie and any detective drama on telly. We've got to kind of pick apart and listen and look and find out what factors are relevant for that particular individual. And also, it gets messy because all of these factors interact with one another. So once we've tried to figure out what factors might be relevant for that person, it often starts to make sense as to why particular activities can be triggers for really draining our battery. So a lot of people describe to me any time when they're trying to concentrate, whether that's listening, watching a television or a film program, being part of a conversation. It might be concentrating to read or to fill out benefit forms, that kind of thing. It wears you out really, really quickly. Worrying is a huge drainer on our batteries, and this is why we do need access to psychological support. Travelling seems to be one that's particularly a drainer for people that I work with, and I think that's because of the amount of sensory bombardment you get when you're travelling. You know, there's lots of visual stuff going past you that's noisy. You've got your balance mechanisms activated as well, let alone the thinking you're trying to do about why you're travelling, when you get there, what you're going to do, am I going to be delayed, and all of those things. Socialising, really fatiguing, really draining, very stimulating, I think. And that can actually contribute to why some people might stop socialising, because they just can't handle all of that. Shopping, particularly supermarkets, busy supermarkets, shopping areas, trying to make decisions in the moment, anywhere where there's lots of information to process, alongside things like lack of sleep, being hungry or in pain. Is that familiar to you? So what do? Two things. We've got to think about monitoring where our personal energy levels are so that we take action soon enough. We can't take action when we're completely drained because we haven't got any resources left to work out what's the right thing to do. We just have to stop. So we've got to try and sort of think about it a bit like a traffic light system I've more recently started to use. Amber, when you're at amber, what's that feeling like? And try to spot the signs. When my battery's kind of half charged, how does that feel? That's the time to take action. That's actually the time to try to take a break. And do I ever feel fully charged? You know, I never have I call this my Tigger moments when I'm absolutely bouncing and full of energy. I'm certainly not Tigger today, this is anxiety. Okay, so pacing. You might have heard people say, oh, you just need to learn to pace yourselves with your energy. Really easy word to say, really hard thing to do, because how do we know how to pace unless we've figured out what's contributed to us experiencing the fatigue in the first place? So again, we have to do a detective and sort of say, well, okay, if these are the kind of activities that drain a lot of energy, don't do more than maybe 1 or 2 of those in a day. What am I going to do in the middle of those to recharge? Can I spread things out? So it's about planning and organising, but you need some knowledge in order to know how to do that. I think it's really important that people get medically checked out, because things like medication side effects, other medical conditions, disruption to hormone levels, there's all sorts of reasons that can contribute to fatigue that actually might be medically treatable and therefore give you help in that direction. So do speak to your doctor about that. And a really, really important thing, and why you're all here today, is talk to others, realise you're not the only one, and find out from them how they manage it, what their experiences are. Share your experience, and that's as important for supporters of people with cardiac arrest as it is for those who have survived it. What helps you recharge your energy levels? Okay, everybody's very individual, and it isn't necessarily as simple as saying just take a rest. Okay, because of the different types of energy, Some people who do something physical and get physically tired and then stop doing something physical to take a physical rest, that's great. But if you're mentally worrying or emotionally worrying things around in your head and somebody says, oh, just sit down and take a nap, how easy is it to switch your head off? It's really hard. So actually that might not be relaxing. So we need to sort of work out for each of you what's going to be most helpful. And sometimes switching between physical and mentally demanding activities can be helpful. So it really does depend what type of energy you're depleting. Fresh air, relaxation, meditation, mindfulness we've talked about before. Power naps can help. I'm not going to get into the debate of how long a nap should be because that's very contentious. What I do know is that most people say don't nap after 4 o'clock in the afternoon or it really disrupts your sleep-wake cycle. But how long the nap should be? And see your doctor for advice about anything to do, because I think some people had questions about supplements and medication. That's not my area of expertise. Please talk to your doctor about that. A healthy lifestyle will help us in general. So all the things that the NHS are trying to promote and change for life are all going to maximise oxygenation to the brain and help us to maximise our cognitive functions and our physical functions, and there's lots of advice on the internet to help us to do that. Modifying the environment, similar to what Barbara was saying, if part of the fatigue is because we're being crowded by lots and lots of sensory information, bombarded by it all the time, then actually what can we do to help cut down some of that stimulation? And it might be something like wearing dark glasses to cut down the lighting, trying to turn radios off rather than having a conversation with a radio or telly going on in the background. It might be adjusting the temperature, because some people's temperature gauges can get really skewed after an injury to the brain. Labelling, organising, decluttering. Again, easy to say, not easy to do, because some of us are tidy freaks, neat freaks like me, and other people can find exactly what they need in what I would consider to be a complete nightmare office. And even where we sit in a room can impact on us. So I went to a course recently about how we kind of make sense of our senses and process sensory information. It was coming at it from a slightly different angle. But I always sit on the edges of things, because what I'm trying to do is cut down on the amount of unneeded sensory information so that I can focus on what I need to. And I learned that was a really good technique for me, because fits my personal preferences. So it's working out what our preferences are, where we thrive, where we don't, and putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. There are cognitive strategies to help us be more efficient, whether it's because we've got a poor memory anyway or because we've now got additional difficulties with memory or executive functions. A neuropsychologist, a clinical psychologist, occupational therapists and neurological rehab teams can help support you to identify strategies that might be helpful. And we all use strategies. You know, partly why we have PowerPoint slides is so that the speaker can remember what it was that they were going to say, as much as it is to give information to you. A lot of us wear glasses. We wouldn't think about that as a strategy, but it is. Using smartphones or Google Maps now to help us to get from A to B. So it's about building up our toolkit collection to help us to do the things that are important to us with the least effort and the most efficiency. Okay, so we all use alarms, reminders, planning systems, checklists, that kind of thing. Switching off the brain is really tricky. Really, really tricky for some people, where their head is whirring and whirring and whirring. And as I said, this is a really big drainer, and there's all sorts of reasons why our head might be whirring, very practical reasons, but also we might be somebody who's experiencing lower mood or anxiety or worry, feeling like we're not as effective as we were before, worrying about the future. They're very real worries, and they need to be addressed, and they need to be supported in supporters of people with an injury as well. So if you do need to access additional support and you're not sure where to go, and the line is busy to Marco, then also speak to your GP. Talk about access to psychological therapies, which are more available across the country. There are some very big waiting lists, it's true, but it may well be that you can access additional support through there. So in conclusion then, managing fatigue is complicated. It really is a puzzle that we have to kind of solve. But it is a common experience. It is real. You're not being lazy. It may not just go away. For some people it does. For others, we need to learn to sort of work within our available resources, and that might change on a day-to-day basis. We need to understand what are the factors that are affecting us. Why is my fatigue occurring? When does it happen, so I can learn how to pace myself? But it's an individual experience, so we have to spot our own warning signs. We need to be able to sort of judge how much of something we can do, and if we can, try to increase that once we have the capacity to do so, and know when to stop. We need to have a shared understanding both with the professionals we might be working with, but also with our friends, our family, our employers as well. For some people it's going back to work, actually trying to help them understand about how fatigue might impact people in the workplace and what reasonable adjustments they can make is really important. And it's about experimenting. It's not a trial and error approach, but it's not an errorless learning approach either. But it's experimenting, it's working out what works for me and what doesn't, so that you can do more of what works for you going forwards. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, that's my contact address. In addition to the resources it sounds like you've developed as an organisation, Headway have got some excellent literature as well. And oh God, that sounds like I'm plugging my own story. Anyway, my colleague and I wrote a leaflet on managing fatigue for Headway, which won an award many years ago, and it may well be that there's some information in there that might be of interest or relevance to yourselves, and it may be that I can work more closely with the organisation afterwards to help develop resources for you if you think that this kind of information is of relevance to you. Thank you.